Okay, here we are, right on schedule. I'm talking to Lisa Marie Hayes today, and she has an interesting combination of things in her resume, and I'm finding out there are even more of them. But she is a relationship expert. She is the editor of Confluence, and she also, which is an online opinion. How would you describe Confluence?
I would call it a digital magazine. It's primarily focused at women,
Mm-hmm.
and obviously coming from sort of like a liberal bend in
Mm-hmm.
that. But it was intended to bring like everything a woman might be looking for into one place. Like,
Oh,
there's some lifestyle stuff, a lot of political opinion, and some news, all
okay.
into one site. Yeah.
I gotcha. And then the other aspect, which is very, very topical, is your deep dive into police use of deadly force.
Right.
So, yeah, which we'll definitely talk about. So, the first things first, I mean, how did you become a relationship expert or coach? Coach, I will say coach, because I mean, who can ever fully understand relationships?
Right. Yeah. I took coach training decades ago, right? And at a time when nobody knew what a coach was.
Hmm.
Like, I remember when I was telling people I was taking coach training, they were like, oh, like volleyball or soccer? Like,
Yeah.
no, like life coach.
Hmm.
But I weaved in and out of it through a lot of years. I worked in a technology business for a while. I've done a lot of like political campaign consulting, but coaching really provided me like this really sweet niche where I could make an incredible living
Hmm.
while raising my own children by myself, which was
Okay.
sort of my goal. Like
Hmm.
I didn't want to have to farm that out to other people. And when I was raising my oldest, I was a single mother.
Hmm.
So that felt even more important to be able to not like I don't know. I wanted to raise my kids on my own terms, and that's what coaching really did for me. And I love the work. I mean,
Hmm.
in a lot of ways, it's very similar. It's advocacy work in a lot of ways.
Okay.
The relationship piece of that, I think, the school of hard knocks. You and I were joking. We said before, like via messenger, we all got to learn the hard way.
Yeah.
And I've made every relationship mistake in the book, like all
Mhm.
of them, sometimes gloriously, like really. I've I've navigated a lot of bad decisions in my relationship history. And so, really took sort of the coaching angle with some of my life experience and then some additional training on that and
Mhm.
found a sweet spot with relationship coaching, which I really love because it's all about relationships.
Okay. And I will return to that because it occurred to me that on a grander scale, that would be very helpful if the whole like interpersonal relationship thing could be just taken more globally, I think. But
Right.
anyway, I'll return to that. Okay, so well, let me ask you even a little bit more biographical information. Where are you from?
I'm in Mexico right now. We moved to Mexico almost a year ago.
Hmm.
We moved in August of 2019,
Hmm.
but I'm originally from Washington State.
Okay, and that's where you got into the police use of deadly force.
Yes.
And what drew you to that?
Oh, 2016 was quite a year. Um, you know, I don't know how you can not be affected by it, right? Like, it is an issue that I'm choosing my words carefully because I want to get this right. I mean, as a parent of white boys, because I have two boys,
Mhm.
we have always felt like we needed not to like raise them in tunnel vision of whiteness.
Mhm.
And I look back at 2016 where this became very big, I think sort of nationally, a lot of things were going on that year. Freddie Gray being one of them. Um, we really just as a family started looking at this issue more and more and more and more. We actually attended some protests in Seattle on that issue and took our youngest with us. Like we really initially looked at this as something that we wanted to focus on as a family, as a parenting decision.
Mhm.
Because of that, we didn't want to raise our boys in a vacuum of the social issues that other people face.
Mhm.
Um, and I lived at that time in Olympia, Washington, which is the state capital, which I believed, and most of us did, right? It was like this liberal enclave of like really free thinking, sort of left leaning thought, very, very Democrat in its sort of political demographic makeup. We all believed we sort of lived in a liberal haven, so to speak. And um, there was a police shooting in our community that garnered quite a bit of, I would say, local slash statewide media attention. Two boys were on skateboards. They had may or may not have attempted to like steal some beer or a watermelon. I don't know. I mean, that all of that is still in question. From a local Safeway store. An APB was put out for them, and they were both minutes later shot by a white police officer who did not wait for backup. Neither one of them died. One of them was paralyzed, though, still is paralyzed. But that experience so close to home, like I remember getting the message that this had happened and that there was going to be a press conference at City Hall. And because I had been very intimately involved sort of in city government with a lot of political officials, because I did do a lot of campaign management type work, campaign consulting type work, I picked myself up and went down to City Hall and sat on the second row for that press conference and listened to it and thought, this is not going to go well for the city. The narrative seems funky from the very beginning. Washington had like a run up of odd sort of high profile police shooting cases. I mean, it kind of seemed like for a period of time, it was like the wild, wild west where there were a handful of them. One involving a pregnant Native American woman. There was another 2 or 3 other sort of high profile cases in Seattle. But Olympia, where I lived, an hour from Seattle or Tacoma, some of the bigger cities, we never saw that happening in our community, and yet it did. And the police narrative in a lot of ways did not hold water. And here we were in it, like as a small community, we were in this very fiery space of protests and conversation about police accountability. We were sitting on the porch one evening and we were talking about what do you do? Because clearly, even early on, we could tell these boys weren't going to get any justice, right? That was not going to happen. Ultimately, the 2 of them were charged with the crime. And both did jail time. And decided that, like, kind of looking at the Washington state laws, which at that point were labeled as the most regressive in the United States, decided to write a ballot initiative and run a voter ballot initiative to change that law. Ultimately, it took 2 years. The second year, a larger statewide coalition came together and finally got it passed, but it did ultimately take 2 years to change the laws in Washington state on the languaging around use of deadly force. And I look back on that, the effort that it took to get there, the dollars that we spent getting to that point of changing the laws. And even with what we got, I fear it was not enough. I mean, parts of what were accomplished in that process, some, requirements for de-escalation training, some requirements for different kinds of reporting or first aid on the scene, like those kinds of things I think will make a difference. But the process of doing that taught me how complicated law is in various states around use of deadly force and how difficult it is to actually affect law without some very, very specific languaging changes that I don't see any state of the United States adopting.
Okay. Well, and so like you took it upon yourself, and then was it just you, or did you immediately contact some of these people whose campaigns you'd worked on? Or, I mean, it was just you and then...
a coalition of families of people who had lost family members to police violence. And some of those families had very, very, very strong voices. I mean, I've watched these families navigate this territory, and at first, like it happens, and the confusion sets in. Then sort of this, I want justice for my family member thought process sets in, and then it kind of transitions to, I don't want this to happen to anyone else's family member. And I mean, I see this happen over and over and over again. You kind of watch it, the trajectory of that with the families that you see on TV with these cases that make national news. Almost always they roll into sort of a place of, let's try and prevent this from happening again. How can I protect my community? How can we work with law enforcement? How can we change the laws?
Mhm.
And we were very fortunate in Washington State that the makeup of the families at that point, they supported each other well. It's complicated, right? Like not everybody works well with everybody else, but there were some really strong voices in the family communities that came out, including the Native American community, which had lost a young woman.
Mm.
And the families really coalesced around this issue, and then ultimately invited, like I said, various state groups, advocacy groups, and different things into the process. But it really turned out to be about those families, which was painful for them because you're reliving it every day as you're working this process. A voter ballot initiative is the hardest way to change a law. A lot of people don't think it should be done. It is not easy to do. And like plugging people who had just gone through terrible, painful losses into that process was not easy for them. And I still like refer to them as my families, right? I mean, the love and the admiration that I have for them, for what they were willing to go through publicly every day as we worked through this process, I can't, it's a lot. Beautiful, beautiful, powerful humans.
How many families?
I'm not going to say how many families, lest I miscount, which is kind of the problem, right?
Wow.
Like Washington State, like many states, was divided geographically in half. There's mountains in the middle, and the western side of the state is very liberal. The eastern side of the state was very conservative. And as we moved forward, I mean, we started with a core group of probably 5 families or so. But as we moved forward, it was like every other day we were finding another family, another story that never got told. Yeah. Something else that happened on the eastern side of the mountains that didn't know that there was a movement on the western side. It was just like uncovering one story after another story after another story. And all of these stories had very similar themes. But I'm not going to say how many, because we never really still, I don't think it's easy to get a solid count on what that looks like. But the core group that really drove the initiative forward and stayed with that for the full 2 years was probably a core group of about 5 families.
Okay. And so in the course of doing this, you said you researched police use of deadly force in all 50 states and internationally. Can you tell me some of the things that stayed with you about that research?
Well, first of all, I mean, there's been a progression of police use of deadly force language in the US, because up until like the mid 80s, I would say, there was a deadly force, sort of unspoken deadly force standard that said by any means necessary, which means that we're going to apprehend a subject, or we're going to apprehend a suspect by any means necessary. And if they turn and run, we're still going to go do this by any means necessary. And that's really important, I think, in terms of this conversation that we're having very immediately right now, because in the mid 80s, there was a Supreme Court case that kind of challenged that, and it was no longer okay to shoot somebody in the back, a suspect who was fleeing, to shoot somebody in the back. And then all of the states had to sort of legislate around that, because policing law is subject to state legislation, not federal legislation, which is an interesting part of this. I mean, states' jobs are to keep their people safe as they see fit. And so when we're talking about police reform, we often think about it as a problem, as a challenge, as a federal challenge that addresses all the states. But that is not the case. Each state individually legislates this law. And so after that Supreme Court case in the mid 80s, like a lot of the states had to go back and sort of re-examine their use of deadly force laws. And then we ended up in this sort of murky territory where most states have some language that addresses the officer's state of mind. So words like in good faith, that the officer was acting in good faith. Washington had an extra line of language called without malice, in good faith, without malice. And those kinds of state of mind questions written into black and white laws play in the favor of the officer every single time, because what ultimately happens is if an officer can make the case that they were afraid, that they thought thought someone was pulling a gun, that they thought somebody was going to lunge at them, that they thought that something they were holding in their hand, a cell phone, whatever, might have been a deadly weapon, then that just flat makes the case, because the state of mind language, what an officer was thinking when such and such happened, it becomes sort of a bulletproof defense, no pun intended. Because you can't question what an officer was thinking. I mean, I think about one of my families in Washington State whose loved one was having a mental health crisis. He was having a real bad day. And he had trespassed into a lumber yard where he'd been released from the hospital before his family could get there to help him. He had walked away from a hospital after a physical incident. He was not doing well. He ended up in a lumber yard, and somebody called to report a trespass. And I believe even in the 911, the woman who called said that, he doesn't appear dangerous. He's not, he's just there. And the police responded, and we believe that he was probably reaching for his phone to call his mother. But I mean, he picked up his cell phone and was shot and killed. But that's a defense, right? Because they thought he was reaching for a weapon. In the case that happened in the city where I'm from, in Olympia, the two boys were skateboarding. So they were in possession of skateboards, which were then subsequently determined to be potentially deadly weapons. Therefore, the police officer had the right to be afraid and then shoot. So this state of mind language in almost all of the state statutes is a solid defense. And as long as state of mind plays into it, it's going to be really, really difficult to prosecute officers, because if an officer can establish that they were shooting in good faith or that they had a reason to think they were afraid, then the defense is in place. And juries have a really hard time negotiating around that, as do prosecutors. I know that I will say I know good prosecutors who might want to prosecute bad cops, but when they know they're up against a state statute that is going to provide a defense, oftentimes prosecutors don't touch it. Because they know that these statutes will create very murky court cases, and the likelihood of gaining a conviction around those statutes is so unlikely that it's almost not even worth putting the families for in some states. So what we know is that there is no state in the United States where the state law meets international standard, and that the standard that most countries adopt, particularly European countries, is a standard that basically alludes to last resort. It was the only thing that we could do. And that there were no other options available. And that really takes out the gray area of whether or not an officer was afraid.
And we've never had laws like that in this country. I don't know how far back you went.
No, we've never had laws like that in our country.
Well, I mean, I've read articles, and I don't know how far back in research you went, but that some of the first militias and these sort of policing forces were based on capturing runaway slaves. And so as a result, some of the language was pretty loose in that regard, so they were allowed a lot of latitude, shall we say, because of the disregard for anyone who had dark skin. So and that history again sort of underlies some of the policing practices that have continued to this day.
I would say some of the police departments that continue to exist today. And I don't want to get into like a really inflammatory conversation about all cops are racist. But I mean, there have been, the Department of Justice did put out information that said that they were concerned about white supremacist attitudes in police departments a few years ago. Back to Olympia, where I am from, just recently, within the last couple of weeks, after all of the big nationwide protests. Olympia is a community that will protest pretty hard. There had been some protests, and a white supremacist militia came out to defend the gun store, and an Olympia police officer was in photographs with those folks using like white supremacy hand gestures in her photographs a week ago.
Wow.
Maybe 10 days ago, like she posed for photos with them, thanking them for doing such a good job defending the gun store with, these hand gestures.
Hmm.
And this is Olympia, Washington, which, like I said, is a liberal haven, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not the kind of community where you would expect to see that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the more you look at police departments, the more you kind of have to question in many places how attitudes of white supremacy or maybe even bias or unconscious bias play into modern policing every single day. So, I mean, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that, and it seems like the culture is even deeper than white supremacy in that I don't know if, I'm not a police officer. I mean, I have a cousin who is, and I can't say we've talked about this extensively, but even the culture of just backing up your own, even if you're not white. Like I noticed that a couple of the cops in the George Floyd situation were Asian. I've heard of, in Freddie Gray's case, some of those officers were Black. So it seems like there's just like the culture of silence and supporting each other is even deeper than that. And obviously, I mean, one has to keep saying it. It's not that everybody is a racist or this police chief in Houston, Acevedo, I think is his name, has come out, and you get some that do come out and say, and I saw Val Demings on The View today, and she was a former police chief in Orlando. So it's not everybody, but I think, what I made the comment that there's certain situations where being a bystander and not saying anything, and if you're sworn to serve and protect, this whole idea of like the good cop, but they know that someone is a bad cop, but they're not going to say anything because they're afraid. That to me is I don't know, that's pretty deep. That you have, yeah.
I mean, I will say that I have clients, like people that I admire and I care for, who are in law enforcement or are former law enforcement. Yeah. I mean, I think the generalizations, well, they work for some reasons, right? Linguistically, it's like Black Lives Matter. I mean, like that is a very confronting statement to a lot of people because it feels like a generalization that a lot of people don't want to like lean into. All cops are, can I swear? No. Like all cops are bastards. That one. Sorry for swearing. I mean, all cops aren't bastards, right? Of course,
certainly not.
Of course, Black people don't only think that Black Lives Matter. But these stereotypes kind of exist for a reason. And when you're looking at police departments that are experiencing exactly what you just referenced, which is kind of my sticking point, it's like, okay, I don't believe that all cops are bad, the bad apple theory. But until the 90 some odd percent that are good cops are willing to investigate, testify against their brothers and sisters in blue, that taints the whole system in a way that is not fixable. I mean, you can't work around that, right? Because they would have to be willing to both investigate and testify against the bad cops. And I have seen police departments fold in on top of themselves and protect their bad cops over and over and over and over again. So without investigative transparency, we are depending on cops to police themselves. It doesn't work in a system that operates without question behind the blue line. And I think independent investigations is a really important conversation to be having on this topic, because there are many police departments in the US that still investigate themselves in the event of an officer-involved shooting. But even when you're dealing with regional task forces, which is what exists, sort of the next step up is a regional task force, you're still talking about, the regional task force might involve the sheriff's department and officers from 2 or 3 towns that are close by. They all still know each other. They're all still friends. They all still, go to the same bar and drink together. They may not be from the same department. So officers investigating themselves when that blue line exists is another thing that I think ultimately ties prosecutors, like puts prosecutors in a box because the investigations themselves become suspect. I will share something I'd like to illustrate that. The two boys who were shot and killed, or not shot, but or they were shot and not killed in Olympia. The officer gave no statement for 72 hours. It happened on a holiday weekend, I think. And he didn't give a statement for 72 hours, which they are usually given time to do. So the boys were in the hospital. Both of them had been shot. They had to give statements immediately. One of them had been in surgery. There was an officer waiting in recovery for him to make a statement. I mean, imagine what that's like. They have to make statements immediately. The cop gets a period of time in almost every state. And 72 hours after the incident, I mean, we haven't had time to canvass the neighbors. We haven't really had time to look at any of the crime lab evidence. We haven't had anything. 72 hours later, the officer was brought in to give his statement with his union rep attorney. And before the interview even happened, like they were like describing on tape, like narrating on tape what was happening, the officer who took the statement from the officer who had shot these two boys said, "This is the victim interview with Officer Donald." They had already, before any investigation had had time to happen, identified the police officer who had shot two boys as the victim.
Wow.
And that was a regional task force, by the way. So that wasn't even a department investigating a department. That was a regional task force member taking that statement. And before the investigation had started, they'd identified the officer as the victim. Which is so typical, so extraordinarily common.
Wow.
The narrative immediately shifts to, how do we prove the officer didn't do something wrong? And one of the easiest ways we do that is by narrating around this idea that the officer was the victim.
So, I mean, you mentioned a strategy that you thought was perhaps the best strategy for dealing with the situation. And can you talk about that a little bit?
Everybody wants to change the laws, right? I did. It's so badly what I wanted to do because I thought changing the law would fix the problem. And I knew that changing the law was going to be hard, but in my mind, it was like, we can do this. Because when we tell the story to the people are going to understand that these laws are really messed up. And ultimately they did. I mean, that did in fact happen. But the process, where we started with what we wanted and where we ended up by the time we negotiated with law enforcement and, tried to find common ground and came together and worked, I mean, it watered down significantly. And we did not come anywhere close to what I think needs to happen, which is that European standard of, last resort. We shot because it was the only thing that we could do. There were no other options, no other choices. I don't think I recognized at that time that was languaging that's pretty much required if you're going to be cut and dry in prosecutors' offices and in front of juries. I just say that with the expense that we went to, and I don't mean like dollar expense, but time and energy, and actually won, changed the law in Washington State. I don't think that we got very much that was measurable in terms of changing the deadly force statute. We got stuff that was measurable in terms of requiring an up level of training, which I do think we need to address. In many states, police officers are required fewer hours of training than barbers and beauticians are, which is not okay.
My goodness.
I mean, those things need to be changed. The fact that we have to make it law that they have de-escalation training, like that seems like it should be so obvious, but it's not. Like the training requirements, I think that could be and should be addressed on a state level. But the actual use of deadly force statutes, there's too many cogs in the wheel. You change the law, then you're dependent on prosecutors to do the right thing. You are subsequently dependent on law enforcement people to investigate law enforcement people to present a case to a jury. It is not impossible. We've seen it done. And by the way, when you see a cop prosecuted, they are almost always either not white or they are female.
That's true.
Still, white male cops very rarely get prosecuted.
Yeah.
So we hold up these few that do get prosecuted and we say, oh, look at this happened, except they're almost never white male cops,
Yeah.
which is the vast majority of, the demographic of police officers.
Mm.
I believe that there is a backdoor into police reform, which is to leverage the relationship between insurers and police departments. And when I say that, I mean, what we need to understand is that almost every police department has some sort of liability insurance that they use to protect themselves, their jurisdiction, and their police officers. Without it, like, jurisdictions are at way too much risk of large lawsuits. And insurers have a unique ability to lay down the law without changing the law. They can require training in police departments if they see patterns within a police department that they're negotiating based on their risk as insurers. They can make an officer very difficult to hire at another police department, which stops sort of the passing on of bad police officers, which happens very frequently, by the way.
Yeah.
An officer is involved in a bad shoot in one community, he just moves to another police department, maybe nearby, maybe further away. I mean, there are stories about some police departments actively recruiting those officers because they like officers that will take a harder line, right?
In Florida, they recently
it happens.
Something. Yeah. Go ahead, sorry.
And that's been happening for a long time. So, I mean, if you've got insurers involved in this, an insurer can look at the risk of hiring one of those officers and be like, we can't touch this because the liability risk is too high. There have been instances, and don't ask me to quote them without pulling up my computer and looking at it, where insurers shut down police departments, shut them down entirely, caused them to disband and reorganize differently because the liability within a bad department got to be too high. So insurance companies have this really unique ability to both influence the culture of a police department by requiring training, by requiring certain abject standards of behavior without the laws. Like, they don't answer to anybody. They just lay down the law about what's going to happen, and specifically addressing specific bad cops in the system and saying this person needs to go, this police chief needs to go, this officer is no longer, insurable. Insurance companies can do it without any of the political ramifications of trying to change legislation. But there's a problem with that. You got to sue. In order for an officer to become a problem for an insurance company, they don't care so much about the internal investigations. There's a complaint against an officer. Doesn't really hit their radar. What hits their radar is a lawsuit. And so what tends to happen to families, whether you're individually a victim and you survived or you lost a family member, what tends to happen to families is there's a little bit of pressure to hold back. Let's get through the beginning of this. Let's see if the officer's charged. Let's see what happens, and then go ahead and file a civil suit. The problem is, if the officer's not charged, you've lost a lot of leverage in your civil suit. If what's most likely to happen, even if the officer is charged, the officer is found not guilty, you lose leverage in your civil suit, and then attorneys won't touch these families for free. A lot of attorneys like to get out in front of it in the beginning when it's big and bold and there's a lot of cameras shining on it. But families need to be empowered to sue early and often, file that civil suit. And they need to be empowered by communities stepping up and handing them the dollars that it takes to hire an attorney to do this. I mean, and we look at these departments, I mean, all of the, the officer had 18 complaints against him prior to X, Y, and Z happening. What you've got to look at is how many lawsuits were there. If there had been 5 lawsuits, that officer wouldn't have been on the force. We wouldn't have gotten to 18 complaints. So communities can organize for very functional and very, very measurable change within their police departments from a culture and a personnel standpoint by making sure that families have the resources that they need to file the civil suits, which then influence insurers to force change on the back end.
Well, I mean, everything always boils down to money, doesn't it? I mean, like if you don't have the money but I guess that is something for the people who are advocating now and donating towards whatever they're donating towards to have on their radar is creating legal funds, and hopefully you get, some pro bono lawyers stepping up and doing some, helping out with this. But well, at least that's a ray of hope. I mean, how hopeful are you that this moment will produce actual change? It seems to me like I'm hearing so many stories. It's almost like a lot of these, I can't say a lot, but more than enough of these police departments or police officers are kind of almost saying like F you, because you're still hearing these stories and people still doing things publicly, even though they know they may be wearing body cameras, or they may know that there are people in the public is watching, and then they're still kind of, I don't know, just doing their thing.
I'm going to say, I mean, in researching all of the things that you could do, everybody likes to talk about body cameras. I mean,
Yeah.
you can sell body cameras on both sides of the fence, right? The public
Right.
likes the idea. Police can be sold on body cameras too, because it will clear their good names if they're accused of something.
Mhm.
Body cameras will only work in police departments from a public safety standpoint if an officer is fired on the spot for turning off their body cam.
Hmm.
And to the best of my knowledge, there are no police departments in the United States that have that policy. It's very difficult to fire an officer because you're dealing with union stuff, which gets really complicated.
Mhm.
But body cameras, as we know them now,
Mhm.
protect the officers and oftentimes don't protect the public, because officers can turn them off at will. So
Mhm.
they will leave them running when they are experiencing something that they think makes the public look bad.
Mhm.
But the number of cases that we see where there's no body cam footage
Yeah.
makes body cameras a completely ineffectual tool for public safety when it comes to policing. I mean, that's so easy to fix. The rule needs to be, if you turn your camera off, that will be the last day you carry a badge and a gun. That's it. But
Mhm.
police departments don't have that rule. So all of the conversation around body cameras is a lot of like feel good lip service when police departments adopt body cameras and everybody feels good about that. They think things are going to get better. It is very difficult to find body camera footage that actually implicates an officer in a bad shoot. They almost always turn off, which is why sometimes you see dashboard cam footage.
Mhm.
Like that's a little harder to tamper with in the red hot moment.
Yeah.
But I mean, the first FU, right, is shutting off your body cam.
Mhm.
And I don't know, your bigger question, do I think this is a moment that is going to create change?
Mhm.
I think this is a moment that has already created some change. The question is are we looking at the right kinds of change that actually make a difference? And body cams being a good example of that. Like when we get a big win and a big police department gets body cams, that's only a win if we're changing languaging in law, which like I've fully participated in that process, where it's just massaging the language to make everybody feel good, that's not really a win.
Mhm.
So we need to be really clear that I do think that change is happening right now, and the momentum is changing, and the dialogue in white communities, which is important. We need to talk about what the dialogue in white communities is, right? Like the dialogue in white communities is changing, but we really need to make sure that we've got our eye on the ball for change that actually protects people, not sort of lip service change that prevents more protests.
Because I was reading, Ibram X. Kendi has this very suddenly extremely popular book called Stamped from the Beginning. And I can't say I agree with absolutely every word that he writes, but I'm reading the epilogue, and what he was saying was that it's not the idea of convincing people that, oh, wow, people have such a hard life, or there's this uplift suasion thing where people try to say, look, these people are truly worthy or whatever. And he said, and I think it sort of ties into what you said about the insurance companies. It's like when there's self-interest, it may not even be that people really hate or think that Black people are inferior or anything. It's just that we have self-interest in things staying as close to the way they are or the way they were as possible. And so, if there's some sort of self-interest, and he was talking about LBJ and some of the civil rights laws that passed before. Well, America is presenting itself in a certain light, and then you have all these television cameras showing dogs and hoses and things that make people across the pond think, wow, maybe these people are not really a shining city on the hill or whenever. I mean, I know that language came later, but that whole idea. And so I guess my concern is like in the current climate, I mean, I suppose this is the real tension is like, it seems like the current administration just doesn't care what anybody thinks about anything. And so like, if the rest of the world thinks we're awful, or he just seems to have set himself aside and said, well, I'm only going to talk to these people and I don't care what anybody else thinks. So the self-interest, it will be interesting for me to see, what happens next. And I do see this groundswell of, or enough of a groundswell, I guess, of attitude shifts for right now in the white community. It's tough to be in a position of thinking that, okay, well, we have to wait for the white community. I mean, you hate to feel like that is so important to your own self-determination and where you're going to end up. You know what I mean? It's
but
not,
I think,
yeah.
I mean, choosing my words carefully again.
Yeah, it's hard. Yeah, I know.
It's not about waiting for well, it is. I'm going to broad stroke this. I'm going to say that racism is a problem that Black people can't fix. Mm-hmm. People of color cannot fix racism, right? They can be a part of a conversation that educates an oppressive class, mm-hmm. but they are not likely to be able to fix that problem because by nature there's a minority status, right? And so I want to back up a little bit to where you were saying that Trump doesn't care. He cares very much. He's very calculated. He's doing exactly what he's doing on purpose, which is really activating and empowering voices of white supremacy. And I would even go so far as to say fascism. Mm-hmm. I mean, we look at him and we think like he's this bumbling idiot on the Hill that's just
I don't think that.
He's extremely calculated. Mm-hmm. And so,
but I mean, I don't think he cares about his standing in the rest of the world.
Right. And I totally agree with what you were saying there. That he does not care. I think that white people need to fix this. They have to fix it. I mean, if you're looking at legislation, right? Like the majority of legislators are white men. Mm-hmm. Or white people. I mean, just like the demographics of the power structure as it exists right now, mm-hmm. white people need to be responsible for cleaning up this mess. And one of the things that white people can do to really get active about cleaning this up is support people that don't look like themselves to be in power. Mm-hmm. To find, candidates of color, to give their money to those kinds of campaigns, to see to it that they are actively being a part of shifting that power structure so that we can start seeing representation in government from the city level clear to the federal level that has personal understanding of these kinds of issues in a way that white people can't have. I mean, as much as I love and adore you, right, and I know you, and I would advocate for you, to my last breath, I don't understand what it's like to be you. I mean, we're both mothers of boys, right? We both have male children. My white male children are much safer in the world, and I know that factually than yours. I mean, we need people who have more diverse experiences in positions of power. And that is going to be a requirement, right? White people are going to need to step back with their time and their dollars and support people that do not look like them to step into positions of power and leadership.
Well, we'll see how that goes. I mean, I'm remembering I was talking the other day to Louise Toppin, whose dad was a scholar of Reconstruction. And Reconstruction was obviously not yesterday. So, things hopefully have changed. maybe there are enough attitudes that are changing or have changed, but that was the thing, is like there's so many people who are really, really nervous if you start giving too much power to those people. So I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, I feel like I have a lot of allies, and I'm sure that I'm not the only person who would say, like, allies being people who don't look like me, and I feel genuinely are concerned about the situation. Um, I mean, and there is a move towards more, just supporting our own, so to speak. I mean, I'm not sure I can really segue back to the whole relationship thing, but, I kind of hate the idea of people having to move to their separate corners and just do their own thing just for themselves, in the sense of, okay, well, here's the solution, is like, we'll just do our thing over here and hope that you guys leave us alone this time, and you just do your thing and just leave us alone, and then, everything will be okay, just leave us alone. And on a grander scale, I mean, obviously, I mean, we all have a common humanity, despite the difference of our experiences, which, I don't think that we need to have the same cultural markers or whatever to respect each other, all that sort of kumbaya stuff. I believe that should be the thing, but I don't know. I mean, I'm hoping that out of all of this, there is some healing. I mean, I find that, I see these casual things on Nextdoor and things like that. And it seems that there are people who, and I'm one of them, I guess, we believe what we want to believe on some level, and then we tend to find people who validate what we already believe. So you have a Candace Owens, and she's saying things that people want to hear, and so suddenly, well, listen to Candace Owens, she's an expert, no matter that she's an extreme minority of the minority saying what she says. So I don't know. I mean, I think that I mean, I've seen that the poll numbers as far as approval in some demographics that were, very much in the Trump column, seems to be going down a little bit. I sometimes wonder at my inability. I don't wonder at my inability. I just wonder, who are these people who leave some of these categories in double digits as to, what you're supposed to do in certain situations, and what is okay.
Well,
But I mean, I think, I mean, what are the choices? I guess the choices are to just be in a state of complete despair, and, or to just go about, live your life as much as you can, and see if there's something that you can do in some small way to make it better. I mean, for me, what you did, whether or not you feel like it changed everything. I mean, you did something, you moved the needle, and you have more information from which to try to move the needle further. And you're still dedicated to trying to move the needle. And I think that if we were to lose all the people who want to move the needle, then we're really screwed. So, I mean, yeah,
what we
go
did
ahead.
was what we did was we started a series of really uncomfortable conversations. I mean, we were
Yeah.
the first state to try and change. We may still be. I mean, Washington may still be the only state to
Mhm.
have changed policing laws via ballot initiatives, and there was a lot of uncomfortable conversations.
Yeah.
I think we're about to find out where we're at socially in terms of change. There's a big
Hmm.
indicator hanging out there in the wind that could like fall any day.
Hmm.
Does Joe Biden pick an Amy Klobuchar? I mean, he's promised he's going to pick a woman, or does he pick a Kamala Harris, right? That decision is going to be made with a lot of information filtered in terms of where we're actually at.
Hmm.
Does that campaign, the Democratic Party, feel like the support is going to be more powerful from a white conservative Democrat, or a black woman, a powerful black woman from California?
Hmm. I think, and Kamala has some strikes against her in some of her prosecutions.
In terms of law enforcement of
Yeah,
officers,
she
right? This
does. She
very
does.
topic,
Yeah.
this very
Yeah.
subject. I
Yeah.
had a really hard time coming out and saying that I could support her, knowing her history on a subject that is so foundationally and organically critical to the health of community of colors. But
Yeah.
I'll roll, right? Like I'll roll at this point, and I
Yeah.
would support whatever. I would
Yeah.
much rather see a Kamala Harris over an Amy Klobuchar, because I think if we see that choice, it indicates that we have turned a really important corner in terms of consciousness and change, right? Like it would say something about what smart people who are crunching numbers believe is happening in the consciousness of the United States. And I think there are a lot of people out there who want to move the needle, right? I just think that we need to be, I mean, now I'm going to sound like kumbaya, right?
That's
like,
okay.
there's only so much I can do about moving the needle, or someone like me, without the voices, the leadership of people who have different experiences and look different than me, because I have blind spots to a lot of things that other people see every day.
Yeah.
Therefore, we have to work together. We have to find a way to work together. And I think that happens really well in lots of communities every day across the United States. But when we get in these really hot moments like we're in right now, the divisions look larger than they actually probably are. Is that true? Is that true? I'm not sure that's true. It might be true. I want to think it's true. I want to think that the divisions are larger than they look.
Well, I think it's a case by case thing. I think some of the divisions are actually as big as they seem, and some of them are not. And I think that, you just kind of go with what you can. I mean, I have to say, I have been encouraged by the worldwide nature of the protests, and whether that is purely about this particular issue, or whether it's just a general disenchantment with it's tapping into oppression in different places, and different people are saying, yes, we're piggybacking on that. We felt it too. We support you, and we support ourselves as well, as far as, whether we feel like we are free or able to move up the so-called ladder, whatever it is that is holding people back. I mean, I know that a lot of the young people, I know young people are no more monolithic than any other group, but it seems, from my daughter is 22, and her generation seems like it's leaning away from some of the things that have been institutionalized. I will say that I also read somewhere, and I try to read in small amounts, and hopefully things that will not drag me down. But I mean, this isn't terrible, but just every 50 years, according to some person's study, every 50 years there's this upheaval, and then people say, okay, this is a mess, we need to do something. And then people really are active, and then something happens. And then over time, people forget, the next generation forgets what happened that caused the upheaval. And then things kind of start going back in the other direction. And then it goes. So I guess it's the pendulum swing that some people talk about, which I guess is better than a downward spiral. So anyway, but I mean, there are obviously a lot of complex issues involved in all of these things, and a lot of complex issues that are not this particular discussion that also require our headspace. So it's an interesting time. It's a very interesting time. So, well, good for you though for doing the micro and trying to help people have interpersonal love relationships that are supportive. No, I'm serious, because I mean, like, we can live in this grand space only so much, and I guess at the end of the day, if you don't feel like you have supportive interpersonal relationships that you can at least feel safe in, then you really, then life is really, really tough. So, so good for you. And do you want to talk any further about just that aspect? I mean, I'm wondering, they're talking about COVID, which is still there, and how it affects people having to live with each other. I mean, are you finding an uptick in people having problems, or just to change the subject a little bit for the last few minutes?
I have told my single clients recently, this will be the best time in modern human history to date and find love. I think that the narrative of how hard it's been to be like quarantined and sequestered with your husband, and it's funny, like we laugh at it. I think it might be a little bit oversold. I think what I'm really seeing is a much deeper issue on the other side of the fence, sort of that single side of the fence, where a lot of people have really had to experience deep aloneness in a way that they've never had to experience before.
Yeah.
And some people are like very profoundly peaceful and satisfied single.
Hmm.
But I think that a lot of people at this point may be looking for a different kind of connection. People who've been single for a long time realize that they don't want to go through stuff like this by themselves anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Like they
Hmm.
just there's a surge, so to speak, of desire for connection on all levels because we were
Hmm.
isolated from each other.
Hmm.
And so, to answer your question, no, I'm personally not seeing with my clients and my couples like a lot of fighting and, but I
Hmm.
don't think there's going to be a surge in divorce when
Okay.
this is over with. I think
Hmm.
there's going to be a surge in new relationships that move from dating to serious very quickly
Mm.
because we've learned the value of being able to connect with the people and with the people that we love.
Hmm.
And so, are people irritated by each other? I mean, yeah, we've not been stuck in small spaces in any way, but I think that even people who maybe struggled with that transition to quarantine have
Hmm.
had to up their game in terms of cohabitation and communication and
Sure.
problem solving and what have you.
Yeah.
From a relationship standpoint, from a,
Hmm.
love is the answer standpoint,
Hmm.
I think societally we will come out of the COVID crisis stronger, smarter, more adept, and more committed to nurturing or finding love than we've ever been before.
Hmm. Well, I will say, as someone who's quite happily single, that the idea, though, of being forced to be distant and to actually communicate with people, I've read, that idea as well, is just like, um, you know, I can't remember. I wish I could remember the funny Twitter post that someone had, but it's like, you're going to have to get to know me, because,
Right.
I'm not, yeah. So, the idea that people actually communicate and actually have to find out who they are,
Right.
before jumping to some other phase that perhaps is not related on who they are actually,
Right.
hopefully is a, we'll see if that holds over, if everybody's just like so desperate to
Well,
get
I think
connect or,
we're better communicators than we once were. All of us
yeah,
are.
yeah,
All of us are
that's
better than
true.
we once were. And a
Mhm.
lot of people who are really happily single are extroverts. They get
Mm.
a lot of their, connection in a very extroverted community kind of way. They're involved in their communities in different what have you.
Mhm.
Those people have been isolated single, which has been challenging. But
Yeah,
I think that we're smarter, we're more adapted, we're more fluid than
yeah.
we were at the beginning of this crisis. And when it comes to relationship, in so many
Mhm.
ways, that's what this has all been about because we were
Yeah.
isolated from our relationships. So
Mhm.
I am not worried about COVID-19 having a negative effect on people and their love. And
Okay.
their love of love. I'm actually quite optimistic on this front. On this
Okay.
end, I will
Okay.
unequivocally say I'm very optimistic that love will be stronger, reign supreme. We will be better communicators, and we will deeply appreciate those we love
Yeah.
in a much more meaningful and like functional, like not just lip service, but actually the act of appreciating people will be different.
I'll say, having both of my kids here, that I do feel like our relationships have deepened,
Right.
and having a young woman, I mean, we didn't have a lot of some of the problems that people have. I think, I'm not saying that everything has always been smooth sailing as she's grown towards adulthood, or that we'll never have any conflicts or disagreements. But yeah, I think I can see, in a different level, in a different way, how that could happen, if you are open to the idea that here we are, we're in this situation, and we're going to communicate about it and be real and appreciate and embrace each other. So yeah, I can see
And,
how that would happen. And so
and
and shall I mention your book? I don't know when it came out, but for if people want to read more about this particular topic, you did write a book called The Love Whisperer.
I did. You can find me at Lisa M. Hayes. That's
Okay.
Lisa Marie
Yeah.
Hayes,
Uh-huh.
lisamhayes.com.
Okay. All
And
right.
there's all kinds of articles and things and info there. So yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. And you can check out Confluence as well with
it's
um,
confluencedaily.com.
confluencedaily.com. Okay. Well, I think we've killed off an hour. We managed to do it. So
We knew
woohoo.
we would. We didn't even
Yes.
plan. Do it
Yes,
all.
I knew. Well, thank you so much for taking the time, Lisa, and
Thank you.
hopefully we'll chat again sometime soon.
Thanks
And
for having me.
okay, enjoy the rest of your day. All
You
right,
too. Bye
take
bye.
care. Bye.